Data protection legislation has its own unique terminology. In this video, we're going to decipher some of the key terms and put them into context within a school environment. First up is data subject. A data subject is any identifiable living individual to whom personal data relates. And yes, they do have to be alive. For schools, this is likely to mean teachers, it will mean pupils, it will mean parents, and so on. If someone is identifiable from the information the school holds, then they will be a data subject. So that leads us on nicely to what is identifiable information. So when we're talking about information that can identify somebody, we're referring to personal data. And it's important to decipher whether something actually is personal data because the GDPR is only concerned with protecting personal information, personal data. So while the school might handle information that's extremely sensitive or confidential, such as financial budgetary information, confidential SLAs or contracts that you have in place, unless they contain personal data, it's not going to involve the GDPR. Now, the question of whether something is personal data comes down to whether you can directly or indirectly identify someone from that information. So, being able to directly identify someone is quite simple. That's going to come through something like a name or a photograph. And that's direct identification. Where we're talking about indirect identification, that's where you'll have a piece of information which on its own you might not be able to identify that individual, but when combined with another piece of information, they do become identifiable. So for instance, a mobile phone number isn't going to necessarily directly identify somebody, but when you combine that with another piece of information, then it may well do. And that's indirect identification. But to summarise, if the school is processing information that involves an individual, it's most likely to be personal data. So we know that schools will handle a lot of personal data. And it's the school that makes decisions as to how that personal data should be used and what the purpose is for. In making those decisions, that makes the school a data controller. And it's the responsibility of a data controller to comply with the GDPR. Now, when we talk about using personal data, that's what leads us to this definition, to process, or we're processing personal data. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be physically doing something with the information. While you might be sharing information, you might be copying, it can also mean that you're storing, archiving, and also deleting information. All these actions will mean that the school is processing personal data. And the one thing not to get confused with is that because the school is processing personal data, that doesn't make it a data processor. A data processor is something different. And because that's quite a complicated area, we'll be covering that on a separate video in a bit more detail. If you want to find out about what you should be doing when you're processing personal data, then tune into our next video, which is going to cover the data protection principles.